first afternoon session. My name is Alessandro Gomez from Yale University. I'll be chairing the session. And the topic is going to be adaptation and energy justice. I must say that we'll make a very short introduction without using the prerogative of the session chair, primarily because I'm a fish out of the water. I am an engineer, a professor of engineering. I've never been surrounded by so many lawyers, and I'm very new at the issue of energy justice in general, but it's something that's really intriguing me very much, largely because there is a good fraction of the engineering community which is totally unaware of this business of the energy business, of this noble initiative of energy justice, and largely because the people who do R&D go where the money is, and there is an awful lot of money in this area, but hopefully things will change in the near future. Now, today we are very fortunate to have two distinguished speakers, and they both have a technical or quantitative background. As undergraduate, the first speaker, Mickey Glantz, was an engineer, and then he decided to move on into the area of political science, in which he got his doctoral degree. We'll do things slightly differently, partly because I have a short attention span, and so having to listen to two talks and then having to remember at the end what questions to ask about the first talk doesn't work for me. So we'll do first talk, 5 minutes interruption with questions, and then we move to the second speaker. So let's start with Dr. Glantz. He's the director of the Consortium for Capacity Building and has a very broad range of interest. His research portfolio includes issues on African drought, desertification and food production problems and prospects, societal impacts of climate anomalies, climate variability, change and extremes, developing methods of forecasting possible societal responses to regional impacts of climate variability and change, and the use of climate-related information for economic development. Thank you. So, Mickey, it's your turn. You have 20 minutes, and I'll be starting waving either yellow cards or red cards.
Okay, okay. And I will try to pay attention to you as you're waving your cards. Actually, when I went back for my master's degree in 1962, I had to live in the law dorms at the University of Pennsylvania. So I have a link to the law schools. You can't see this very well, but the question here, and I don't know if they're going to keep these slides or whatever, but I can send them to anybody who wants to see them. And this is a map of the Earth at night. And you can see clearly a line that separates the developed and the developing world. And it's a line you're going to see it in a little bit again. And I just want you to know, I had two presentations. One I worked on for 3 weeks, and I decided I didn't like it last night. So you have the new one, all right? So you can ask me for either one. This is one of the few surviving slides. All right, I wanted to show this. Coal, too much of a good thing? And if you were to look at this, you'd see, which you can't read, it's a little strange. You think the law school would have had a shade. But anyway, and it says here, no, it's okay, just for this one. Or turn the lights out.
Yeah, I was trying to get the lights out.
Yeah. Anyway, it says here, it's a ship, and it says success to the coal trade in the 1970s. That's why I said, is it too much of a good thing? One of my punchlines in some of my talks is that what we don't need now is an IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. What we need now, after the Nobel Prize, is an EPCC, an Engineering Panel on Climate Change. Why? Because the engineers got us into this mess. They gave us a good life. They gave previous generations a good life. And we should call on engineers and mercenaries. You give them some money, you give them a contract, and you tell them what you want. You want peace, they'll come up with ways to develop objects for peace. If you give them money for war, they'll find better bullets. So my feeling, and I was an engineer, I have a blind faith in engineering. I think because right now we have a lot of geoengineering ideas being bandied about, mostly by the lab scientists, the physical scientists who worked on the IPCC that got us got them the Nobel Prize. But I think it's time to move on and pass the baton to the people that can actually come up with realistic solutions, and that would be you people. Back to the past. Yes, history does have a future. This is a time machine, and let's go back to the past a bit. I just want to remind you of a few things that maybe you missed in previous decades now that climate's hot. This is when climate was not hot. Here's a book that came out in which they talked about the other energy crisis, Eric Ekholm. And the quote by an Indian civil servant in 1976, I'm left-handed, using two, very difficult. Here, firewood crisis. Because at that time, people were cutting bushes and shrubs in order to cook their evening meals. In a way, we're now coming out with reports saying everyone's got to do their part. The third world, they must, what? Stop eating? Stop cooking their meals? So the shortage of fuel wood became a big crisis, and he alerted to this back in the early 70s. And then I added this one. It says that even if we have enough food in the future, how in the world would we cook it? That was the Indian civil servant. And thinking about this, it says even if we have enough energy in the future, will we have enough food to cook or water to boil? So these are our new issues. Back in 1970, SCEP, MIT, they held meeting, top scientists held a meeting called Study of Critical Environmental Problems. And in it they said, it focused on global atmospheric problems to a certain extent. Global problems do not necessarily, they said, need global solutions. If the US acted alone, China acted alone, two countries, a true win-win, to reduce their fossil fuel in a serious way, that could be a large step towards solving a problem. Then it says, in the foreseeable, this is the part that gets me, in the foreseeable future, advanced industrial societies will probably have to carry the major burden of remedial action. Hello, it's 2010, we're 40 years later, and we're still arguing about this. Should we? Who takes the first step? SMIT, the second of the two reports put out by MIT, pretty hard to find these reports. We recognize a real problem that a global temperature increase produced by man's injection of heat and CO2 may lead to dramatic reduction, even elimination of Arctic sea ice. Hello? It's disappearing. It's way ahead of the schedule at which it was expected to disappear according to the models. This exercise would be fruitless, this whole two-volume thing. This exercise would be fruitless if we did not believe that society would be rational when faced with a set of decisions that could govern the future habitability of the planet. Hello, 1971. Okay. Spirit of the Times, the Stockholm Conference, Only One Earth. This actually kicked off a lot of things. It led to the creation of NOAA. It led to the creation of UNEP, UN Environment Program. But this was probably the first big conference on the environment, at least in my career. But there were several issues. Norman Maier identified several issues that were not mentioned here that have since become big issues. Deforestation, ozone depletion, and global warming. A lot of other things that really focus on pollution and nuclear stuff and trying to bring about some attention towards equity in the global community.
What year was that?
That was 1972. I was already 80 at that time. I was just getting, actually it's the year I started to switch to get into, leave political science and revolution studies to come into study climate. All right, now, the future has arrived earlier than expected, and that's what's happening now. Some of it's real, and one of the real things, I think, is the melting of the Arctic sea ice. So we see the model projections, again, they're model projections, saying that we're going to be at a certain level of sea ice, it's going to shrink by 2020 to a certain level. In 2007, it was at that level, okay? So now it's accelerating. So you see a lot of articles in paper, and I believe it is. I believe it is going faster. But then all of a sudden, I can't tell what other things are going faster. And then tropical deforestation is going faster, soil erosion is going faster, we're losing species faster, everything's accelerating. And I can't tell what's real and what's hype, because we're all looking for the dread factor that will make policymakers move faster than they move, which is pretty hard. Okay, so global warming tipping points. We had 3 assessments, then there was a 4th assessment. They get the Nobel Prize. for the fourth, or in the fourth assessment. You get a Nobel Prize for the inconvenient truth. But my reason for showing this is this. The fourth assessment got a lot of attention. But without a third assessment, there was no fourth. Without a second, there was no third. Without a first, there was no second. Without limits to growth in 1972, there wasn't any of this. Without the Stockholm environment, there wasn't any of this. So we're all standing on someone else's shoulders. And I think that's what's missing in recognition of IPCC4 getting a Nobel Prize, which I believe is on behalf of everyone that came before. So the spotlight has shifted, much to the chagrin of hardcore physical scientists. Why? Because now this policymakers, okay, you convinced us the climate's changing. What are we going to do about it? That's working group 2. That's the impacts. That's working group 3. That's policy. How do we deal with it? So now, at the trough of funding, the scientists have to move over and let in social scientists, lawyers, economists. Every other discipline now is there to get some of that share. And the physical scientists are sent back to the lab to monitor. Okay, tell us if it's going faster. You've convinced us. It's a different world for the physical. We expect different things. In Science Magazine in October, it said impacts research seen as the new frontier. Back when they created the IPCC, it was not even the last frontier. They really didn't care about that. It was about science and policy, not impact. All right, humans in the climate system. This is a beautiful rendition of the climate system. Climate change impacts on the United States, U.S. Global Change Research Program 2000. It's beautiful. I love this. Okay, I really love this diagram. It's so nice, and it really fits the situation in the year 1000. But it isn't today's. See, it's missing people. All right, we today are like sea ice. We're like the trees. We are a factor. No longer can the models just have an arrow going in. Humans did this. We are an integral part of that modeling system, or an arrow coming out affecting society. We are an integral part. So society is a part of the climate system, not separate from it. The other thing I want people to know about the 4 laws of ecology, very common stuff. We use them, maybe some of us, younger people, don't remember where they came from. But, you know, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Everything goes somewhere. So when we talk about some energy things, when you go from coal to wood, or wood to coal, or steam to something, it's not a free ride. You go to biofuel, it's not a free ride. Something is being affected somewhere else. So they are, I don't know how you can see these in the back. So everything is connected to everything else. Everything must go somewhere. In other words, there is no away. Nature knows best. There's no such thing as a free lunch. Any change to the environment generates risks for something. Okay? So therefore, I argue the IPCC shouldn't just be doing adaptation and mitigation, but they should be looking at, and we should be looking at, the softening, the mitigating of the impacts of adaptation. So you can say, plant more trees. Okay, what does it mean? Plant fast-growing trees. Eucalyptus. Okay, eucalyptus also screws up the soil. So, you know, we have to think about the impacts of the adaptive practices. So there's no place to hide. Rich country, poor country, desert areas, coastal zones. We're all kind of going to be affected directly or indirectly by climate change. You can't read this, and I wondered about putting this up, but I wanted. There are a lot of things that are unfair. This is why I talk about inequity. Inequity is defined in terms of fairness. There are many things unfair about climate change. With different amounts of emissions, the rich countries are doing it, poor countries are victims. Rich countries have the resources to get out of the problem. Poor countries are going to have to eat the problem and live where they are, you see. And then there is this thing that I call the climate haves and the climate have-nots. And there's this one, the free rider. I don't mind free riders, okay? George Bush's government didn't want free riders. Oh, everybody has to sacrifice something. Why? If they can't afford to pay, let them ride free. What I don't like are freeloaders. The U.S. is a freeloader because we're going to let everyone else clean it up and we're going to go and just do what we want to do. So we're the bad guy in this one. So free riders, okay. Freeloaders, no. Now, there are many roads to inequity. I'm just talking about climate briefly. That's an old map of Rome. I couldn't figure out an image. Anyway, you know about political inequities and technological. Some people have and some don't. Natural resources, you have it or you don't. Geography, upstream, downstream, sea level, and you're living at sea level or higher levels of industrialization. Access. I believe a lot of what we're worried about is access. I would like access to the capability to become a billionaire. Okay, I would like that. I don't have to become a billionaire, but I don't want to be blocked from trying. And so a lot of the inequality, inequity we see in the global system and within countries relates to access, the ability to try. So injustice, you'll see in this definition from a dictionary, injustice, unfairness. It's why I like the word inequity, and I kind of distinguish that from inequality, even though on the web it's often intermixed. Okay? Equality with Bill Gates is I have his money too, but equity is I have a shot to get his money. Anyway, this is from 1980, the Brandt Commission, Willy Brandt, after he had been chancellor and was ousted. This line is the interesting line. You see, it looks sort of like an aardvark. But anyway, if you look at this line, there's the rich north and the developing south. And look what it called for. Transition from oil-based world economy to sustainable renewable energy sources. Linking together population, environment, trade, disarmament, cooperate, manage the atmosphere. In fact, Ro Brundtland said that the title, Our Common Future, came from Willy Brandt's introduction to this report. So everyone is standing on somebody's shoulders. So we have to remember that. And I worry that students aren't getting that. They're reading the summary of summaries of summaries of something that was written. Go back and read the original. And right now, unfortunately, I'm like everybody else. I go to a bookstore, I look inside, when was it published? 1999. That's like 1899 now to many students. So if it doesn't have 2000 or later, it's just not useful. We have to keep reminding them that we're standing on shoulders. So this is the developing South here and from the Brandt Commission. I like this slide, and it looks more like Anteater now. All right. Back in 1990, I did Winners and Losers in Global Warming and on assessing, because there are really no indicators of a win or loss. I know a win when I see it. I know a loss when I see it. But to get 10% more rain in an arid area, tell me when. Does it come in one storm? It doesn't mean anything unless we know more information about it. So the idea was to find out about winners and losers, and what are the measures we might use. This meeting was funded by NSF, our US NSF, and by the UN Environment Program. The two program officers were reprimanded, and the NSF guy was fired for supporting discussion of winners. They did not want winners discussed. Because if you talk about winners, then maybe some people won't agree. If they're a loser, then they won't sign an agreement. That was my take on the reason. It was horrendous. It was a great meeting, but horrendous. So today, there is a normal climate system. It has produced winners and losers. The US is a breadbasket. Okay? The Ukraine is a breadbasket. The Sudan is a basket case. Somalia is a basket case. So you've got these countries that are barely struggling to grow food, and you've got others that are doing well. And a lot of it has to do with the climate and the soil and the terrain and that kind of thing. So I just want to say we already have climate winners and losers now. So what I call them climate haves and climate have-nots. Whoops. And today's haves, my question, do they owe anything to the have-nots? Well, if you ask me, say no. Climate, until recently, climate varies on its own. I'll help them with humanitarian aid, but I don't have to. Okay, I don't have to. I'm going to be a nice guy. Do they owe anything to tomorrow's have-nots? Yes, because someone is changing the climate. Someone is responsible for those changes in climate, and therefore they must help the victims. All right. Do climate winners have a responsibility to help climate losers? Should they? This is a World War II without rationing and control, and the bottom is with rationing, something for everyone, instead of the rich taking. This image could be used for land grabs in Africa now related to biofuel and food. So there are foreseeable changes that we can see in health, agriculture, forests, water resources, coastal areas, and natural systems. We know that as it warms, things are going to change. We don't know how bad or whatever, but we know, and there are things we can do. We know sea level will rise. Glaciers are melting all over the place. Okay? So we do know some things, and we can start to act. Now, what happens is, in comes the rider on a white horse, the white knight, to say technology's the answer. Let's geoengineer the world. Let's plant trees everywhere there's soil, sequester carbon everywhere. Recent article in the UK about, oh great, we can sequester the carbon and make a lot of money. You know? But they're the guys that put the stuff in the atmosphere in the first place, starting off the Industrial Revolution. So they make money both ways. So, you know, you make it putting it up, make it taken out. It's very nice. Anyway, sequestering trees. China's into planting trees all over the place. Renewable energies and biofuels. These are the schematic showing the various schemes.
2 minutes.
Oh, oops. But what was the question? Technology is always the answer. All right? The question, what do you do? Because humans are doing this stuff. And a lot of it relates to fossil fuels and tropical deforestation and some other chemicals. All right? All right, so that's our dilemma. So what do you do? Well, I think a lot of these things are Band-Aids. They can't solve the problem. You can put iron in the ocean, you can do all these things, but you're not attacking the problem. The problem is the way we use energy. And you have to go full bore and deal with the problem. Okay? So we go to fossil fuels, biofuels. This is the idea for biofuels. And I understand there's a lot of discussion about biofuels. Here's ethanol, a cartoon. Pardon me, but do you have any food? She's asking in the car. Because the corn is being fed to the cars. There are many cartoons like this. And then there's this one where the executive is saying to the starving kid, give me the corn, I need it. I need it to run my car. There are several of these kinds of things. And that's that conflict between biofuel production and feeding your car. Now, as a result of the biofuel craze, we rushed into biofuels. Corn is great. Corn is going to help us with CO2 when it actually produces more CO2 to get there. Anyway, so these are the countries that are where food is being replaced. They say we're going to use marginal land and all that, but actually they're using land, taking land away from subsistence farmers, and I'm being threatened here. Anyway, so this is what's happening, and you've got a land grab by South Korea, China, Abu Dhabi, Saudi Arabia, and they're going, South Korea with a 1.3 million hectare deal with Madagascar to grow whatever it wants for 99 years in Madagascar, a hungry country. And what happened was the president was overthrown and they threw them out. I just got it. Anyway, so here's one a little closer to home. The Netherlands. Half the country or so is at sea level or at risk. There's Bangladesh also. Here's an ethical question for you. Talk about inequity. Where will 10 million Dutch go if half the country's underwater? Some of them will go to the highland, and some of them will go to anywhere in the world. They're educated. They'll go all over the place. Anyone will take them. Where will 50 million Bangladeshi go? Who will take them? Myanmar? India? Who? Pakistan? Where are they going to go? The US? Europe? So there's a question that we better be grappling with. And then a lesson from Katrina. And what it says is that New Orleans was unstable socially, politically, economically, racially. And when the storm came, whether it's a climate change related or not, I don't believe it was, but I'm just saying that any system is at risk to collapse if you have these kinds of inequities that exist at the time that climate changes. So yes, worry about climate change, but there are a lot of inequities we can take care of now that we don't. That's it. Presentation if you like.
No, I think I'm going to use this for different purposes then. I think we have time for a few questions. One over there.
Nikki, I wanted to ask, you're from NCAR, right?
No, I'm not from NCAR. I was fired by NCAR in August of 2008 and immediately given a grant by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Clinton Global Initiative to move to the University of Colorado immediately.
Oh, okay.
To NCAR's chagrin. I'm sorry.
I wanted to ask,
That was a good question, actually. I get to say that.
If you know about Hyper and Hippo?
No.
Because there's this, I went to see this plane the other day that's going to go and test CO2 from 1,000 feet to 45,000 feet and go up and down as they're going, circumnavigating the globe 5 times during the season and take 5 years to analyze this data. And I wondered if you thought there'd be any hope if CO2 could be more realistically quantified, if we got any political gains we can make.
Out of that, I don't think so. I think.
I mean, your talk is pretty cynical. I mean,
What do you mean I'm a cynic?
realistic. Yeah.
No, I'm a cynical optimist. I work in the morning to make things better. I'm not surprised if the political system doesn't move so fast. I'm not surprised that the institutions that we're using to deal with the 21st century unheard of problem that involves everybody is the bureaucracy is created in the 1800s. So we still go back to a units. Okay, when you go back, you can talk global, and you go back, well, I do fish, I do trees, I don't know about the global scene. So I can't answer that. I don't think more science at this point like that, it makes a difference. It's good for NSF, they'll give them money, NASA will give them money, but if I'm cynical about anything, it's time to move on and share the resources with the other disciplines that are resource starved.
Time for one more question back there.
You were talking about the have and the have-nots and kind of who's taking responsibility and how the West doesn't really want to take responsibility for what it did, and also how a lot of the new technologies that we come up with are actually just band-aids, and we actually need to change our thinking about the way that we use energy. What do you think can be done to make people understand that it's actually a worldwide issue and everyone is actually going to be affected by the policies that we're using now if we don't change our way of thinking about using energy as a whole?
Well, okay, you don't have to convince everybody. You have to convince the people that make the policies. And so, I mean, I'm optimistic. I think, it showed a poll in the paper today in the camera, and it said, a Pew poll, and it said that there's a big drop in people who believe in global warming in the US, 20% or something, a big drop. But my feeling is more facts. Facts is not equal education. They need us, the social scientists, the lawyers, to translate some of that science. And you have to integrate that fact into the ordinary knowledge base of everyone. It's not just, oh, look, they're smart, let's believe them. We can show people. The problem is we've wholesaled climate, the climate change problem. We've wholesaled it. Everyone now is kind of into it. Either believe it, most of them, and some don't believe it, okay? So they challenge it. So we've wholesaled. We've done our job on that wholesaling. Now it's retail. You go industry by industry, sector by sector, level of society by level of society. And that's like hand-to-hand combat. You'll see? That's why we need the army of people. I don't care if they're political scientists. I don't care if they're bachelors. I don't care if they finish school. If you educate them, they'll go out and educate others. Thank you.
Okay, to stop at that, let's thank our speakers. Now we will go to the second speaker, Dr. Roger Pielke from the University of Boulder, Colorado. He's also someone with a sort of a hybrid background, first mathematics, then he decided that he had the quantitative base and moved on to political science. And his research focuses on the intersection of science, technology, and decision making. And Pielke was a scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research before coming to joining the University of Colorado at Boulder. And his most recent book is The Honest Broker, Making Sense of Science in Policy and Politics.
Thank you.
Roger.
I'll just say while I'm getting this fired up, I was brought off the street about 17 years ago by Mickey Glantz. Can you hear this?
Is it on? It might not. Did you turn on?
Can you hear it in the back? All right. And I spent almost 9 years working at NCAR for Mickey and with Mickey, and every single day was like what you just saw. 8 hours a day. So I still have ideas that Mickey gave away at that time that I'm working on now, so it's a pleasure to follow Mickey here. So I'm going to talk not as fast and not as much, but I'm going to present some ideas on adaptation and justice. I'm going to start with a story. I'm going to see if I can get all this straight. And it's a story of a conversation, an informal conversation among some people you've probably heard of that really illustrates this issue. So I'm not sure when it was, sometime in the last year, Andy Revkin, who's an environment reporter for the New York Times, he has a blog, an excellent blog called .earth, and he was writing on his blog about the World Bank and their support for a giant coal power plant in India. And as Andy often does on his blog, he ends up with a provocative question. And at the end, he said, environmental activists are protesting World Bank financing of this giant coal plant due to the greenhouse gas emissions. But if you were a poor young Indian who was to benefit from the power, maybe you would think differently. What do you think? In classic Andy Revkin fashion with the question mark. And one of the first commenters on his blog was Bill McKibben, the writer, environmentalist, who's now heading up a group called 350.org. And Bill McKibben wrote in and said, maybe that young Indian would think about rising sea levels and future storms and would turn down the opportunity for that coal-fired power. Seeing this on the blogs, an Indian engineer, a guy named Siddhartha Shomay, who's also a blogger, picked up on this comment and wrote a very long expose on poverty in India and saying to Bill McKibben, are you crazy? Of course this young Indian would choose to have the coal-fired power plant. Now this story of this discussion gets to what I want to talk about, which is why are we talking about trading off power for poor people versus safety from extreme events? These are not trade-offs. These are things that we have to do at the same time. So I'm going to make an argument that adaptation, as conventionally described in the climate change debate, which means reducing our vulnerability to climate extremes and so on, and giving people access to clean, cheap power, are things we have to do at the exact same time. They're not trade-offs. There are a few people who have said the response to climate change is only to adapt. There's very few people who actually say that. Unfortunately, in the debate over emissions reductions, it gets reduced in this binary fashion. And what I'm going to argue to you today is how we think about the climate change debate has really gotten us into a situation where we're forced to trade off these issues. And that's not the right way to think about them. They operate on very different time scales, and there's equity dimensions to both. And we have to do both at the same time. It's important to do both. So that's preface. Since people always want to know where you stand on an issue, I'll just tell you where I stand on this issue. Ever since I worked with Mickey, I've been a strong advocate for mitigation and adaptation policies. Mickey hired me as a postdoc to work on extreme weather events, to work on disasters. He didn't tell me at the time that adaptation to climate was a taboo subject. And if you worked on adaptation, people like Al Gore might call you lazy and part of the problem. I think that's changed, but the increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide is a problem. And it's something that we have to deal with. But at the same time, we have to be honest with ourselves. We have to recognize, as Mickey well showed, the impacts of climate on things that people care about. And I'm talking about society right now. We also care about the environment, but that's not going to be the central focus. The effects of development and growth are enormous on the impacts that we see around the world. Just because it's important to respond to greenhouse gas emissions doesn't justify being fast and loose with the science of adaptation. And the bottom line, you only get one message from my talk, is that mitigation and adaptation are not trade-offs with each other. We have to do both. All right, so the main points. The very concept of adaptation, what it means, is contested. And how we think about it shapes research and policy. You will be perhaps surprised to learn that the phrase climate change is not defined in the same way by scientists and policymakers. They have very different definitions. And these different definitions lead to different policy outcomes. Under the Framework Convention, so this is the Kyoto Protocol, the discussions that are going to happen in Copenhagen, adaptation is defined very narrowly. It's adaptation to climate change caused solely by the emissions of greenhouse gases. I have a visitor from Oxford, Steve Rayner, who's going to be speaking here tomorrow. And he has a very nice saying that the Framework Convention on Climate Change was misnamed. It should have been the Framework Convention on Greenhouse Gases. This narrow definition creates a pretty strong bias against adaptation, and I'll explain why. And it doesn't really matter what you think about the effects of CO2 on disasters like Katrina and other disasters. The real driver of losses, of human suffering, of economic losses, are inexorable development and growth around the world. And I'll try to make that point. So first I'll start at a conceptual level. Here are the two definitions of climate change. So for the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as Mickey told you, received the Nobel Prize, a climate change is a change arising from any source. So if, while we're asleep in Boulder tonight, the sun gets just a little bit brighter and the earth warms, floods, famine, pestilence, locusts, whatever results, that's a climate change and obviously would be a problem. Underneath the Framework Convention, however, there's a different definition. A change of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere and which is in addition to natural climate variability observed over comparable time periods. So what this means is if, when we are sleeping in Boulder tonight, the sun gets a little brighter, famine, flood, pestilence, locusts all show up, under the Framework Convention they would say, that may be a problem, but it's not our problem because the climate hasn't changed as far as we're concerned. If you can attribute it to greenhouse gases, then that's something we can deal with. And I'm going to suggest that this creates a pathology in our thinking. Now, there's good reasons why the Framework Convention might have chosen to have this definition. There are other parts of the United Nations international architecture that deal with disasters, that deal with development, that deal with health. And so rather than step on anyone else's toes or impede on anyone else's turf, they carved out this greenhouse gas, this marginal effect due to this particular definition of climate change. Now, we see the implications of this definition in the overarching goal of international climate policy. This is the Framework Convention. This is its Article 2, which has its goal. I'll read it to you in case you can't see those dark red letters, which are meant to highlight it. To achieve stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations. So if you hear numbers like 450 or 350, that's greenhouse gas concentration. In a level in the atmosphere that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And then there's some clauses there to allow everyone that's negotiating to have their particular outs. But the point there is a threshold, above which it's dangerous, and below which it's normal, it's okay. It's not dangerous. And what I'd like to illustrate is how this shapes how we think about adaptation. So this is a concentration thermometer, I guess we could call it. It's parts per million CO2, 380 at the bottom, which is where we were a couple years ago. 2 degrees C is often equated with 450, which is the number that most governments are looking at right now, an 80% reduction by 2050, if you prefer. And then 550, which is a pre-industrial doubling. So under the logic of the Framework Convention, if we were to have success at any level above 450 in stabilizing, so stopping the increasing accumulation of greenhouse gases, we would need to adapt. If we stabilize at 450 or below, adaptation is unnecessary. So let's say we go all out with climate policies, and it turns out we are successful in stabilizing greenhouse gas concentrations. But we do it at 550, right? We missed the 450 target. So we would need to have adaptation for all of the impacts that occur in between 450 and 550. Okay, so if we are successful at below 450, no adaptation is necessary. So it turns out from this definition that adaptation is a cost of climate change. Adaptation is a bad thing because it reflects policy failure. So this is why when I was a postdoc working for Mickey and I was saying how important adaptation was, people in the climate change debate would say, oh, you're just one of those people against action. And for a while I wondered, why would anyone be against adaptation? The reason is because I was doing the equivalent of saying, I want climate policy to fail, so we have to adapt. If you look in the IPCC and its cost-benefit exercise for adaptation, adaptation has only costs. It has no benefits. Because if we were to mitigate at 450, we wouldn't need to adapt at all. And you don't have to be an economist to know if a policy has costs but no benefits. Are you going to prefer that policy? Probably not. So if dangerous climate change can be avoided, then adaptation would be unnecessary. So here's a few saying. Al Gore in Earth in the Balance, which was written in 1992, year before I started working with Mickey, called adaptation a laziness. It was an excuse. Now, since then, Al Gore has said he was wrong. It was nice of him to come out and say that. Tim Flannery, the Australian scientist, more recently has said that anyone who supports adaptation supports genocide. Pretty strong comments, I would say. If you take a look at the IPCC in its working group 2, I'll just quickly show this. There's no impacts until 2 degrees pre-industrial has been released. You'll see that that lines up with 1 because that's 1 degree above the 1980 to 1999 average, which is already 1 degree above pre-industrial. But the black lines, none of them start until you get to 2 degrees above pre-industrial. So we don't have to worry about adaptation until we get to that 2 degree threshold. This is politically very convenient, but it also is problematic because if you look around the world, there's a lot of people suffering impacts of climate and climate-related events that may or may not have any connection with greenhouse gases. But that's someone else's problem. So from the perspective of the IPCC, if you're concerned about climate impacts on society and the environment, you can go back up the lines of causality, and there's a lot of things that could be done. So an impact results from the combination of a vulnerability and some sort of extreme event or some sort of physical process. Vulnerability as interrelated societal and ecological factors. Climate change and variability, there's internal variability like in the oceans, external variability, the sun is an example, human greenhouse gas emissions, and there's even human non-greenhouse gas emissions. One of the most important factors that's thought to be leading to the warming of the Arctic and the melting is soot deposition. All those coal plants going up in China have soot that has radiative effects, but it also has albedo effects. If you're interested in modulating these impacts, then there's a lot of things you can tinker with here from a policy perspective. Here's how the world looks from the perspective of the Framework Convention. Because its definition focuses us only on greenhouse gases. So again, greenhouse gas mitigation is really important. But if you start with impacts, there's a lot of things that you care about. And if you start with greenhouse gases, that's the only thing you care about. And so we get into a situation where our advocacy, our debates get conflated. And the adaptation issue then becomes a trade-off. And I think that this is one of the biggest failures of climate policy, is relegating adaptation to permanent second citizen status. So does the definition of climate change matter? I would argue yes, it matters enormously. People rarely pay attention. In colloquial discussions, if you go to a cocktail party, if you look at the newspaper, when people say climate change, they usually mean the greenhouse gas variety. But recognize this is not how the scientific community actually sees the issue. It creates a permanent bias in that it leads to adaptation having costs and no benefits, and it puts science in an impossible position. It means that if you want to respond to some perceived climate impact, you have to prove under the Framework Convention that it was caused by greenhouse gases. It's not enough to say, well, it could be. You have to prove it. And this is, I'll show an example. This is, in fact, written into international law that governs the climate treaty. Now, there's many attempts to create workarounds for this because people do recognize it. And the language that's used is mainstreaming adaptation. And that's kind of an international code word for fixing up the screwed up implications of Article 2 of the Framework Convention. In reality, adaptation has broad benefits. If you reduce the effects of, or the potential effects of drought, say in southern Africa, that's going to lead to positive social benefits in the context of greenhouse gas-induced climate change and not in the context of greenhouse gas climate change. And if you can't tell me what proportion of drought impacts are due to greenhouse gases, it doesn't matter because people are better off anyway. Adaptation contributes to sustainable development, again, under this much broader perspective. Now, I don't expect you to read this, but I want to put it up there so you know that there are some words behind it. This is from a group called the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which goes around and observes climate meetings and reports on them for everybody who doesn't attend, which nowadays there's not too many people that don't go to those. Pretty soon they'll have about 6 or 7 billion people at them. And what they're saying here is the frustration of least developed countries. Because if they want to get money, say, for flood prevention, they have to be able to show that the impacts they experience are due to greenhouse gases. So the rich countries say to the poor countries, we want to give you some money for adaptation. It's really important. We're going to create an adaptation fund. The poor countries say, great, because we have climate impacts, we have people who are suffering. Then the poor countries come to the rich countries and they say, we'd like to get into that fund. We have some of that money now. And the rich countries say, well, okay, but are you sure those were caused by greenhouse gases? You have a lot of development going on. There's natural climate variability. Yes, sorry, we can't give you any of that money. There's a report that put out that said that the money disbursed under the Framework Convention for Adaptation was about equal to what the United Kingdom spends on flood defense in 1 year, which is to say not much given the vulnerabilities around the world. So I'm going to, in the time I have left, go through a case study to illustrate to you fairly quantitatively why it is that the climate signal in disaster losses in particular is not the overwhelming signal. Even so, the climate debate, you can't even talk in the climate debate without invoking hazards, because hazards and disasters are something that are very visceral, that people understand, they see it, and it's a very useful tool in advocacy. And the media likes it also. So I'm going to talk about hurricanes. But let me say there have been studies very similar to the one I'm going to show you, which I first did when I was working for Mickey, that have been done all around the world, rich countries, poor countries, for all sorts of phenomena. And everywhere people have looked, the results have been identical. So I'm not showing you an outlier. I'm showing you a representative story here. I'll skip this. There's a canonical graph by Munich Reinsurance that shows the increasing costs of disasters over time. So all you need to know is that the bars are cost, left to right is time, disaster costs are going up. This graph appeared in Al Gore's movie, Inconvenient Truth. In 2006, with Munich Reinsurance, I organized a workshop to actually try to scientifically, quantitatively explain why is it that disasters are going up. Can we, in fact, attribute some part of this rise to greenhouse gases? Because if we could, that would be good for climate policy. Because we could then say this fraction is due to greenhouse gases. And if we couldn't, then that's important to know also. What we did is, this is the same graph, but by phenomena. So red is earthquake, tsunami, volcanoes, not climate related. So discount red. Yellow is temperature extremes, like heat waves, drought, and wildfire. So maybe they're changing, maybe they're not, but there's not enough yellow disasters to be driving this graph anyway. So what we focused on were windstorms and flood, which is the green and blue part, and which is the majority of large disasters around the world that are climate related. This was sponsored by the US National Science Foundation, Munich Re, which is a big reinsurance company, a German research firm, and a UK research institute. 32 participants from 16 countries. We had 24 background papers. We came up with a consensus report. Remarkably, these 32 people, everyone agreed with 20 statements. And here's 3 important ones. So analysis of long-term records of disaster losses indicate that societal change and economic development are the principal factors responsible for documented increasing losses. Kind of a no-brainer, common sense. This one's important. Because of issues related to data quality, the stochastic nature of extreme event impacts, length of time series, various societal factors present in the disaster loss record, it is still not possible to determine the portion of the increase in damages that might be attributed to climate change due to greenhouse gas emissions. Notice how careful we were in saying climate change due to greenhouse gas emissions. If there is a greenhouse gas signal in that disaster loss record, and there might be, we can't see it because of all of these other things going on. In the near future, we couldn't agree on how long the near future was, so we put an imprecise term there, but decades perhaps, the quantitative link, attribution of trends in storm and flood losses to climate change related to greenhouse gas emissions is unlikely to be answered unequivocally. This was then cited by the IPCC. It's not a message you hear in a lot of advocacy statements or even in political discussions. So here's hurricanes. This is the economic losses due to hurricanes in the United States. We have a nice 100-year record. This is to show that the strength of storms hasn't changed like the damage has changed. And to cut to the chase, we asked the question, what happens if every storm hits with population levels of today, right? Rather than the year in which the storm made impact? So we want to take the population change, the wealth change, out of the equation. This is the story that we get, and for reasons I'd be happy to tell you, we're very confident in this. It's been replicated a number of times. From 1900 to 2005, you see Katrina at the end. This big spike is a 1926 hurricane that we think would have been 1.5 to 2 times the strength of Katrina. But look what we see here. You can understand why we can't see a greenhouse gas signal. Once we adjust for societal change, the dark line shows the moving average. There's no trend. So there's no room left for greenhouse gas. So maybe greenhouse gases have a strong impact on tropical cyclones. I'm not going to discount that possibility, but we don't see it in the disaster record. If you just look at a short record from 1970 to 2005, you get a different story. For better or worse, we have this very long-term record. Let me end. This will be the last substantive slide that I'll show. Here's another trade-off of this narrow definition of climate change. This shows greenhouse gas emissions in Africa under two scenarios. One is with unmitigated malaria. That's the green line. This is world emissions today of higher than 8 gigatons of carbon, just to give you a sense. The red line is what emissions would be if malaria is eradicated, based on a study by Jeff Sachs that says it would boost African GDP by 3% a year. In all climate policy scenarios going forward, looking at African emissions, the baseline assumption is that we are not going to eradicate malaria. So policy success under the Framework Convention depends upon us not eradicating malaria. We have built in a trade-off. Because if we eradicate malaria, Africa alone will have twice today's global emissions by 2050. We shouldn't build in these pathologies to our policy processes. We create powerful disincentives to action, but also we mess up the entire advocacy structure. We should be working for adaptation and for mitigation at the same time. So this is where I started. This is where I'll end. Here's how you can find me. There's a bunch of papers related to this talk that you can download. So thank you very much.
Time for some questions. Lakshmi.
Can I take the microphone? Sure. Thank you, Roger, for an excellent presentation. I totally agree with your conclusion about the need for adaptation. However, I think you've kind of misconstrued the UNFCCC. This morning, I was making the case that the problem with, for example, the Stewart Road to Copenhagen is the obsession with CO2 emission reductions. But we can have a conversation about this later. But I think the villain in the piece is not UNFCCC, but the Kyoto Protocol. Because the Kyoto Protocol singularly fixated on one element alone, carbon dioxide. And the result, as I pointed out, is that we cannot stop black soot because black soot is not a greenhouse gas. And so it doesn't bring any kind of benefits under the Kyoto Protocol, and certainly is not even on the agenda for Copenhagen. That's just a comment.
Yeah, no, I resonate with those comments very much. I mean, I'll tell you, I have come full circle on this issue. When I was working at NCAR, I was a strong advocate for adaptation playing a greater and stronger role under the Framework Convention, then ultimately Kyoto. I'm very much now of the view that it should have no part. Let's not even pretend. Get it out of there. It messes up the politics, it messes up the negotiations. And as far as the Framework Convention, I would say rename it the Framework Convention on Greenhouse Gases and have it be as closely focused as the Montreal Protocol, the Vienna Convention before that, on ozone-depleting substances. Policies work much better when they are targeted at a specific goal. So what does that mean? It means that the Framework Convention is not going to solve deforestation, it's not going to solve poverty, it's not going to solve health, it's not going to solve black carbon, it's not going to do a lot of things. But then again, when have we ever had a single policy that solves all of our problems? It's overburdened. So I guess I've moved much to the view that the Framework Convention and the Kyoto Protocol, and if we have a Copenhagen Protocol, need to be much more narrowly focused on specifics and realize that some of these problems are too complicated.
Time for one more question.
Yeah, I'm from the GEF, so I saw on one of your slides you were making a few remarks that I wanted to correct very quickly. But before that, I think that he is raising a very important point. You also have to understand the international system within which these conventions are negotiated. And what happens is, one paragraph, people will spend weeks and months writing up changing languages depending on their interests, depending on what they want to achieve through that particular convention, and ultimately what you end up having is a compromise. And when you compare that compromise language with a scientific language, obviously they're going to depart from one another. So you have to be extremely cautious about interpreting IPCC definition versus the convention definitions, for example. Otherwise, you're going to just get confused. Secondly, let me get to the issue of the GEF and the adaptation business. I'll have the opportunity tomorrow to say a few things about that. Thank you very much, by the way. I think that your presentation on adaptation, you're making a very good case for it, and I think this is extremely important. We should be seeing this presentation in very many places. But there are distinctions that we make in the GEF in terms of dealing with mitigation issues and adaptation issues. Clearly, there are separate trust funds, separate processes to deal with one and the other. So it appears that there's a little confusion here, because when we deal with adaptation issues, the issue of incremental cost does not come into play. The issue of additional costs, we are completely open to the issue of additional costs. So when you link all of that together and say that, well, because of that, then projects are not being implemented under the adaptation fund, I think that there is a problem. Where you are right, and this is where you are extremely helpful, is that for some reasons, because of his presentation earlier, when you had divided the world into two parts, the developed and the developing countries, those who have historically responsibilities to deal with this thing and those who don't, the donors and the recipient countries, you draw a line, okay? And the whole debate has been skewed towards financing mitigation activities. And the adaptation fund, there's no money. So everybody's struggling to get money from elsewhere. You have the adaptation fund that is established.
I forgot to mention that the questions are limited to 1 minute.
Okay. So if you can really, and I wanted to make those few general remarks to make sure that you be careful in interpreting some of the data.
Yeah, no, I just want to say, I'll quickly say, I appreciate those remarks. And yes, it is very complicated. And yes, the Framework Convention and the institutions under it have worked very hard to try to work around some of these issues that I would say have been very imperfect, and those working very hard to get around them may say, yes, but we've done some things. And I think, yes, those are two perfectly fair interpretations. I'll just end by saying I think that this issue is not going to move forward fast or very effectively or satisfactorily to the countries involved, particularly those that bear the most burden of climate impacts under the current framework. It needs either wholesale reform or an ability to do things differently while maintaining face, which I fear Copenhagen will not lead to any of those positive outcomes.
Let's thank Roger again. There is a break now, right?
Yeah, we have a break. So we return again at 3:30. Please.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Roger.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.